Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley podcast, a production of the Aldous Huxley Centre in Zurich, featuring me, Tobias Harris, and the Centre's curator and author of the new book, Aldous Huxley for Beginners, Robin Hull, as well as occasionally invited guests. Today, we will be starting to look at Huxley's view of psychology and personal relationships and exploring his 1937 collection of essays, Do What You Will. And I'm joined, of course, by Robin. Robin, how are you doing today?
Fine, thanks. Look forward to it.
Excellent. And I get a feeling that we will probably not be dedicating just one podcast episode to Huxley's psychology, because it's sort of this pervasive sense of Huxley, isn't it? Like everything really comes down to individual psychology. So it's a topic that he never left alone. So I don't think we'll cover it in half an hour somehow.
You might be right.
But just by means of reintroducing Aldous Huxley for someone who might be tuning in for the first time, I wonder if you could just start off by talking to us about his own family upbringing and how that may have informed his view on psychology and personal relationships. Because I think for a modern listener, it might be quite hard to imagine themselves into the world of someone like Aldous Huxley, born into his kind of family in the 1890s. So it'd be really interesting if you could tell us, what was it like for Huxley to grow up?
The family super ego was Thomas Henry Huxley. He was there as what they called the grand pater. He was the supreme authority, not just as an academic and an educationalist, but also as a head of the family. His authority wasn't questioned, nor was the authority of his wife really questioned, a very strong woman in so many ways. Then Huxley grew up as one of the youngest members of a dynasty. The Arnolds, his aunt, his mother. And of course, on the Huxley side, there were interesting people too, clearly, including Huxley's father, Leonard.
And
so there's a very strong dynasty there. At the same time...
And Robin, if one didn't know, how would one describe who Thomas Henry Huxley was?
Well, he was probably Charles Darwin's closest associate. He was self-taught and made it right to the top of the educational establishment in England, force of his wits and his tenacity as a scientist. He was also a great one for popularizing knowledge. He ran evening classes for working people in London. So an absolutely extraordinary man in so many ways. He was also a great essayist. His essays were, in fact, collected essays, were edited by his son, Leonard. They're a wonderful read.
And so in a Victorian society still dominated by class and inherited wealth, Thomas Huxley represents someone who's made it to the top of their game through sheer intelligence and hard work, and represents something different about society, represents something much more dynamic and fast changing. And so then that makes sense as to why he'd be such a champion of Darwin's theory and Darwinian theories of evolution, but promised to overturn a lot of the orthodoxies on which that kind of class-based society rested.
That's absolutely true what you say. I hadn't thought of that. I think it's actually very insightful, you say. The thing about the family is it wasn't at all typical. On the surface, the Huxley family was in a way typical for its time and the society it lived in. However, there were one or two significant differences in Huxley's family, meaning his parents. The mother was one of the first female graduates of Oxford. that was still a bit of a novelty at the end of the 19th century. And she was also an entrepreneur. She started a school, Prior's Field, built it up, and it's still going strong. By comparison, Huxley's father, Leonard, is the weaker figure. And when Huxley's mother, his beloved mother, died, Huxley was about 12 years of age in his first year at Eton. Well, he lost his family because his father moved to London. And while Huxley continued at boarding school at Eton, he was then, well, farmed out to aunts and uncles in the holidays, including his second mother figure after the death of Julia Huxley, Mrs. Humphrey Ward. So he didn't really have much of a family from the age of 12 onwards. And then came those horrible blows, the eye infection that nearly knocked him out at 16, and, well, the sort of surrogate parent that he had, his brother Trevenant, who then committed suicide. So one blow and one loss after the other, and a very strong mother who was full of love and who he wholeheartedly respected, and a comparatively weak father who they got on very well with each other in many ways. But Leonard started a new family when Huxley was 16. He married a second wife, and then they had children, and that at 16 can't have been all that easy for Aldous either. So there's a sense of alienation, I would imagine, that also colored his teens and made life later on not altogether easy. Say, getting on with women and having children of his own.
Yeah, it seems like he had his experience of family ripped away from him at quite a young age, with not much put in place to replace it. And although I think that Huxley's experience is particularly brutal in the sense of what happened to him was very, very difficult to deal with, it's also the case that perhaps that experience does bring Huxley's life a bit closer to the experience of so many people alive now, of course, then as well, who of course don't come from families that fit this middle class or bourgeois mold of, you know, a nuclear family and so on. And that lasting, I mean, of course, lots of those families do exist as well, but many people don't come from those backgrounds. And so I do think it's interesting that Huxley would have had to almost, because this seems to affect his view of psychology, right? He wasn't given a model, a template. He had to rebuild the sense of personal relationships from quite a low base in terms of those blows, if you know what I mean, of not being able to see and having these two key figures in his life taken away from him. He must have felt very much on his own, and therefore the task of building connections with others could not have followed a ready-made template.
Completely.
And then that takes us to, for the benefit of listeners, what is Huxley reading about psychology and personal relationships at the time? Like, who are the big names out there that he's having to cope with, and what kind of responses does he develop to some of those dominant figures at the time? Freud, of course, would be one of those figures to contend with.
Well, I would have thought that he's certain to have read some Freud at university during the First World War, and he's also certain to have read more Freud after. And in the 1920s, I would have thought, at the latest, he would also have read some Jung. However, to him, I think the key writers in psychology are neither Freud nor Jung or their successors, such as Aldous, for instance, but rather William James and F.W.H. Myers. James, we know as the author of varieties of religious experience. We tend to forget that he also wrote a 2-volume study of psychology. that would have been a key influence. And the second work by Myers, who also chaired the British Society of Psychic Research, he wrote this 2-volume book on human personality and its survival after bodily death. These works are far more fundamental to Huxley, the great pioneers of psychoanalysis. Added to that, Huxley would probably have said that he learned more about psychology in Buddhist scriptures and maybe in certain Christian mystics than in the actual primary literature to do with psychoanalysis.
So this is a part of a podcast where I am joined by Emily Reed, a historical linguist from the University of Exeter, to imagine what Huxley would say about things as we have them today in 2025.
Yeah, and this first section is going to be on therapy. So what would Huxley say about therapy?
Yes, therapy. Many of us are in therapy. And of course, when Huxley was writing, there were lots of different types of therapy available then too, including psychoanalysis, maybe in its heyday in the early part of his career. So what did he have to say about therapy?
Well, I feel like Huxley had a lot of things to say about therapy, and certainly a lot to bring to our understandings of therapy today as well. So one of the things that Huxley believed in was that we, in fact, house multiple selves. So I am not just me. I am, in fact, several me's, and I am a different me than I was last week, yesterday, and in fact, 5 minutes ago. And the body is almost like a forum that houses these multiple selves that come into and out of prominence. So while he admired psychoanalysts like Jung and even Sigmund Freud, he found them to be a little bit reductive in this sense, because they're only talking about a single cell that is sort of split between the id, the superego, and the ego, whereas he believed us to be a multiplicity of selves, kind of like a messy kind of forum of different versions of the self. And I think the thing he thought about psychoanalysis as well is that it seemed to be a lot of theorizing, philosophizing, but not a heck of a lot of doing. So another thing that Huxley was, above many things, was a practical thinker. He had a lot to say about many different topics, but fundamentally, he wanted people to be able to find practical applications to a lot of these ideas. Otherwise, what is the point? And so I think that kind of summarizes his perspective on therapy, just at a general level, I would say.
And Huxley sees one problem with psychiatry overall as almost dividing up the mind into these arbitrary locations, almost as if there are rooms in a house. And very much the psychoanalysis is located in the basement of that house. And I think Huxley would find that problematic. That's just not a full representation of the self. It's kind of like dirty, messy, horrible basement poking around. I think Huxley would maybe see as a risk of you're almost creating sources of trauma that just aren't there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think as well, like something that is really interesting to know about Huxley as well is we're not just talking about mental health. We're also talking about physical health as well, which Huxley actually saw as very intertwined. He talks a lot about the mind-body connection throughout his essays and indeed in novels such as Island as well. And I think it's something that is interesting for us today to think about, because I think today we focus on mental health, we go to therapy, we talk about our feelings to our friends and family and loved ones. We are very much more tuned into mental and emotional health than perhaps people were in Huxley's day. And we are also, I would say, focused on physical health as well. We go to the gym, go for a run, we eat clean, we're trying to cut down on alcohol, this sort of thing. But I feel that where Huxley comes in, he sees these mental health and physical health as part of the same thing, whereas perhaps we compartmentalize these a bit more than Huxley would. He sees these things as very integrated. I think what I'm saying is that Huxley might be in therapy and he might also have a gym membership.
So he did admire the work of a Swiss psychotherapist who was also a practitioner of Zen Buddhism called Hubert Benoit, and he admired his work precisely because it was an integrated and Huxley would see a transcendental approach to health, in which we're not trying to discover the self that's buried within us. We're actually trying to connect with our whole being in quite a Zen, like Buddhist way, which is different. Again, I wonder if you could give an example of the difference in this practical approach to therapy from one of Huxley's works to help explain how he saw it differently.
Absolutely. So actually, the first novel of Huxley's that I read was Island. In fact, was it his last novel?
Well, his last novel,
His last novel, yeah. So what a great place to start, right at the end. But that was the first novel of his that I read. And I think what I was really struck by in Island was Huxley's treatment of mental health, emotional health, and physical health, and how it all connects together. By way of an example, there is very early on in the novel, the protagonist, he has been caught in a sea storm and he washes up on the island, and he is effectively given mental first aid by one of the young inhabitants of the island, who she forces him to verbally express what he went through and verbally express like how he feels about it in that sense, and keep doing it until it doesn't hurt him anymore. It runs actually very counter to a lot of like how we would deal with trauma in our modern and Western society, because Island is a novel that tries to blend Eastern and Western principles. So it's very different. So in fact, Huxley draws that comparison between the mental first aid that the protagonist he receives, and what would have happened when he was young in the care of his mother, which represents like the Western way of dealing with trauma, as kind of like trying to push it away, trying to calm, to soothe, but ultimately to try to push what happened to one side, saying, there, it will be okay, it will be fine, stop worrying about it. Whereas it's
not sure many psychotherapists would agree with that characterization.
But yeah, what happens in Ireland is almost by repeating the event, repeating the trauma, it makes it a thing. It makes it almost like an object that one can deal with. One can do something about it and work through it.
And I think the other thing that's interesting about that particular episode is the character that delivers this emotional therapeutic first aid is a small child, it's a small girl. And what Huxley is suggesting is that through the education system, we could impart everyone with the practical skills they need to achieve a sense of balance, a holistic sense of a mind-body connection, and fundamentally a contentedness. And that these are tools which we can actually give to everyone. And so maybe he wouldn't see much of a place for a sort of private therapeutic industry as we have now, where people pick their own approach, they find their own therapist, it's a very individual connection. But I think he saw things as being quite social. It's all of society's responsibility to make us all happy, and nothing can be treated in isolation. Whereas the approach we have now is we all have lots of problems and we seek to find an individual therapist to help us. And Huxley would maybe see that as that's just not solving the root cause of the problem.
So maybe Huxley's approach to therapy would be, yes, we should go and seek therapy, counseling, and we should definitely work on ourselves, our mental and emotional health, but in a more almost like a group setting, or in a more, I suppose, like a less individualized setting. Maybe he'd be into group therapy, or sort of like a rollout of therapy.
Of course.
Or maybe things that combine activities that combine a mind-body connection. So thinking of activities like climbing, acro yoga, these things probably would be quite popular.
I feel would definitely do yoga.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Huxley would have done yoga.
Huxley would have done yoga. Okay, cool. You spoke a bit about F.W.H. Myers, maybe just a little bit more about William James, the philosopher, and how his psychology of consciousness influenced things at the time. That might be helpful.
And let's not forget Hume, because Hume's notion of the non-existence of human personality is also a key thing. It ties in, of course, with what the Buddhists say, doesn't it? And there's a few others. Lee, for instance, the author of The Machine, The Man Machine, Julien Offet de la Métrie. So there's quite a number of non-psychoanalysts who played more part in Huxley's conception of psychology than Freud and Jung.
Yes, yeah. And this question of the personality and how these things can be formed, and I guess because if you look at a philosopher like David Hume, then Hume is approaching things from a position of skepticism towards our ability to really know things that are outside of what we can experience secondhand in our minds, right? It's almost the best way to put this, and I think Huxley would agree, is that we use language to describe ourselves and others and our souls and our personalities, which almost infects us with the idea that there is a unitary self, there's a unitary personality, and that is linked to some kind of cosmic order, you know, some kind of other, which helps to shape the way we see the world. But these philosophers and thinkers that Huxley is reading, as well as his own personal experience, are teaching him, of course, that that isn't really true. So in fact, as in Huxley's own words, he'll say things like, we are many people, we are a crowd of people. Think that to this idea of multiple voices, you know, we adopt different poses in different environments. So that is an important realization, I think. And it also is a bit of an antidote to potentially psychoanalytic versions of the self, where there's this sense of people being overly determined by their circumstances into particular molds. Because, of course, if you're a crowd, if you have the potential to be many people, you're not stuck in any particular mode, you know, but maybe it does require a bit more work to understand what you're doing and how you might change that. But I'm intrigued with this rejection of the idea of personality, because I'm not sure that's going to be that clear to our listeners and viewers. So I wonder, what is Huxley's problem with personality as a construct? How do we kind of move beyond that?
Well, Huxley had doubts about this construct already while at Oxford, and perhaps even before. The doubts must have been fed by authors such as Chekhov, for instance, whose short stories give beautiful impressions of our inner world and the incoherence of the different selves that we sort of seem to move into moment by moment. Or the Russian playwright Andreev, who he mentions, Leonid Andreev. He saw one or two plays of his during the First World War and decided, if I write, I want to write like Andreev. I want to give a view of what we're like inside and the whole sort of auditorium full of different selves that govern us. Similar things were happening in art at that time. Cubist portraits by Braque and Picasso, for instance, or what Virginia Woolf was trying with the stream of consciousness. They lead us into the same kind of difficulty inside of determining who we are. Huxley became quite convinced that on the surface, we have a mythical personality that we try to feed and cling to for dear life, because we need it to get through everyday life as best we can and survive. We like to ignore that this ordinary self that we are imprisoned by is actually quite anarchic. It changes constantly and unpredictably, and we like to gloss over these changes and somehow explain them away as moods of one permanent, constant personality, or we try to attribute these horrible changes and fluctuations to changes in conditions and blame it on other people or on events and so on. So we're sort of always at sea on the surface and always locked into this tiny, minute little ordinary self that really tyrannizes us and prevents us from seeing the oceanic rest of us that is actually appealing to us to appear.
I mean, that's a really interesting and useful terms that you've used. The auditorium of the self, this idea of a self as a performance between oneself and multiple other listeners internally. And I really like this idea of the oceanic self, because oceanic suggests a flow of materials and a flow of ideas. And Huxley, he makes a point, doesn't he, in this, at one point in this, I think in this 1937 collection, Do What You Will, but the spirit is a very, if you take this idea of a spirit of, you know, what you can know, what you can learn, that can change overnight into being something completely different in a way your physical body can't change. Your physical body can't turn into a butterfly. Overnight, you might change from being, I don't know, a fascist into a communist or something like that. You know, those big changes are possible. But I wanted to counter with another impression, because as well as these very positive things about the self, any reader of Huxley's essays around this time, I'm thinking of, you know, Beyond the Mexique Bay, that collection of essays, will actually encounter something quite different, which is a very disparaging view of human personality, where he imagines what percentage of a given person is an automaton. Is it 3/4? Is it 9/10? In any case, the proportion is depressingly high. So at the same time as having an expansive sense of the self as multiple, but I think is really valuable and important for us to understand today, he also sees, I don't know, like people as being largely automatic, you know, machine-like, and is quite disparaging of the idea that most people have any free thought at all. So can you help us understand that? Because there's something here about this is not automatic, the recognition that Huxley came to of the self. This is actually, what's automatic is instead something a bit darker, which is really not having any free thought at all.
Well, completely. I think in Huxley's view, it's a function of consciousness. If we are not aware, all our thinking is fairly certain to be automatic and mechanical on the surface. For our higher thinking faculty to enter into play, we have to, A, become aware in order to be able to even notice that it could be there. And secondly, we have to make way for it. For instance, I'm stuck in an academic essay. I use all I have in my ordinary mind to solve the problem and can't. So I get up, go for a little walk, maybe have a coffee, and then suddenly an idea comes to me. And if it's a good idea, it can be seen as evidence of a different thinking faculty in me that is permanently available. And in other words, our ordinary thinking clatters on a little bit like a clockwork mouse. And our higher possibilities in terms of thinking are buried deep down, probably in something like a collective conscious. The same goes for great artistic creation. I can try to sketch something rather badly and then get stuck, and then again go for a walk, maybe have a coffee, and then suddenly there's a moment of inspiration and a work of art is finished or a poem's completed, because I've made way in myself for a higher creative faculty, which is buried there, again, probably in the collective subconscious, at least in the deeper levels of myself. Thinking on the one hand, without awareness, is certain to be relatively disappointing in terms of grasping the meaning of life. Ordinary thought is helpful in designing a spaceship, maybe, in terms of doing the accounts of a company, or in devising a business plan, possibly. There, with my ordinary faculties, I can get quite far in everyday life. Maybe I need these faculties even. But the deeper, higher faculties depend on awareness, and they depend on my ego getting out of the way.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to understand artistic creation or original creation. I think at one point, James Joyce referred to himself disparagingly as a scissors and paste man, in that he saw himself as not an original artist at all, simply kind of epic plagiarist who'd pull different sources and piece them together. But I think what we're talking about in terms of inspiration and creativity and originality in the self is acknowledging that the self is porous. You know, it's not fixed, it's not a wall, it's not a fortification, or maybe it has the possibility to become like that. But in fact, if you allow things to seep in from outside, then you gain access to could be seen as original thought. But as you said, it's really in practice, it's kind of humans tapping into what might be seen as a collective subconscious or collective unconscious of some kind. But I just wanted to pause on this point though, because what do you think are the forces that Huxley saw as contributing to the problem of people being automatons? For example, in part of the collection we're looking at, he, in Do What You Will, he refers cheap printing, mass communication, cinema and radio all have this sort of homogenizing force. They're in a way to enforce what he describes as a kind of a belief in unity as opposed to diversity in the world, a belief that ultimately things resolve into universal values and principles, which I can see how that can be problematic.
Well, what are the factors? We don't think very much because we are mostly asleep. We can't think when we're not a little bit more aware, a little bit more conscious. So what puts us to sleep? It could be that our own love of sleep helps a great deal because it seems attractive. The ego, as it were, intoxicates itself in a state of sleep. So self-intoxication is certainly one important thing. Then our education puts us to sleep massively because we are not really brought up to appreciate the existence of awareness very much, nor are we taught how to cultivate it. And then what one might call socialization beyond education is certainly another thing. Maybe we grow up in families or communities which are profoundly asleep and aren't really bothered with that. And then afterwards in adult life, anything that causes identification is certainly not a great help, such as identification with money or status, the career, and so forth. They hound us, these identifications, and compel us to constantly function in life without awareness. And then beyond that, there's these endless distractions. And there, of course, the love of sleep, the love of being absent and unaware is fed. And we make sure that we are constantly distracted. One could go on endlessly and would have probably added, political ideologies and nationalism and the worship of art as a divine kind of entity, when art couldn't really take the place of God quite so easily, or even high culture, other forms of high culture.
In this part of the podcast, we're going to look at Aldous Huxley's shit list, the stuff that Huxley really hated, and there was a lot of that stuff. And in this one, Emily is going to take us through Huxley's hatred of cinema.
Cinema. So cinema is, I feel in this day and age, not, it is a media that feels a little bit on the decline. I don't remember the last time I went to see a film. I think in this sort of like straight to streaming platform age, it's not something that we do a lot these days. However, in Huxley's day, it was very much a burgeoning media experience, and he hated it. In his essay, Silence is Golden, which is in the Do What You Will collection, Huxley tells us about a time where he first goes to see what they call a talkie, which is I guess it's a film that has sound.
Has sound, yeah, as well as pictures.
Amazing.
Pictures and sound, yeah.
Pictures and sound. And he just really didn't enjoy this experience. So I'm going to pull some quotes to illustrate this fact. So Huxley writes, "I have just been for the first time to see and hear a picture talk. A little late in the day, my up-to-date readers will remark, with a patronizing and contemptuous smile. This is 1929. There isn't much news in talkies now, but better late than never." Better late than never? Ah, no. There, my friends, you're wrong. This is one of those cases where it is most decidedly better never than late, better never than early, better never than on the stroke of time. He goes on. In this essay, Huxley goes on to describe what I saw and heard in that fetid hall on the Boulevard des Italiens, where the latest and most frightful creation-saving device for the production of standardized amusement had been installed. So, I wish I could quote the entire essay at length because it is an absolute zinger, but if you have ever felt the pressure to keep up with the latest trends that you actually think are a bit ridiculous, I would highly recommend you check out Silence is Golden, because you will find your soulmate in Huxley sitting in the talkie having the worst time of his life.
Great. I think if Huxley was around today, he would have looked at social media networks. He would have looked at the idea of developing a personal brand to stand out, of being well known for a particular thing, whether that's a hobby or some kind of marketing approach or something that you do. And then he would have looked at how the education system encourages people to do this in some senses, to develop a fairly fixed idea of their personality and then to follow it and to push themselves out there, and how we've kind of fallen into this idea that everyone should have this strong personal brand. And I think he would have, rather than seeing it as a celebration of diversity and of diverse thought, he probably would have seen it as this embedding of a very shallow idea of personality that's actually building barriers between us and forcing us into molds that are produced by the digital media that we live in. You know, they're produced by the social networks themselves. They're not actually real personalities at all. But do you think you would have seen that this kind of influencer culture like that?
I think the personal brand is a perfect illustration of this. What is the personal brand? I would say it's a cult of my ordinary self. It's a way of worshipping my ordinary self, worshipping what keeps me asleep, worshipping what prevents me from actually waking up and living my life as a more fully human individual. The brand is, well, it's worship of my subhuman self.
Well, yeah, that's fascinating. And I think in a future episode, I think we're running out of time now, but we need to talk about how this more challenging but more liberating sense of the self translates into our personal relationships. But I'm happy with where we are, which is just thinking about the self and this alternative model of the self. And because it just does seem so relevant. And that is where I want to finish, is an idea that any reader of Huxley will come across several times, which is this idea that humans are amphibians. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that a human is an amphibian? Because, of course, you know, we're mammals, aren't we? We're not amphibians.
Well, to any lover of Italianized cream, there's good news, because the amphibian conception of the human mind body is as multi-layered as a Neapolitan ice. So we have some flavor on the surface, and then many different layers that we can't see from outside, leading to the core. From the start, Huxley was convinced that the human mind body is multi-layered. it also took him a while to work out what the relation between these layers should be for man to wake up and become human. At the time of D.H. Huxley was very closely involved with D.H. Lawrence. And his hope was, and he says so in Do What You Will, he says, we ought to live a life of balanced states. In other words, move from all these different states to other states fully, wholeheartedly. It was a year before D.H. Lawrence died and before a sea change in Huxley, where he came to believe that no, unfortunately, if we just live on the surface of ourselves and just permit these states to wash over us and there's nothing there else to maintain order, then we're on the wrong track. And then came the idea of becoming more aware and the idea of being reborn, discovering a new way, replacing false personality with real I through the practice of non-attachment and through the practice of awareness.
Fascinating. I think that there's so much more to talk about, but it's already been a fascinating conversation about a sense of the self, which, interestingly enough, seems almost as radical and shocking, contrary to mainstream versions of the self, probably as it did when he was first writing it. And I don't know what that tells us. Probably some good stuff about the value of Huxley and maybe some bad stuff about the progress of society since the 1960s. But we'll finish it for there. And I think next time I'd love to dig more into what this means in practice. But what does that mean for the way you live your life, and particularly how you handle your personal relationships? But for now, Robin, I want to thank you very much for appearing on this episode of a podcast.
Thank you. And there's good news for lovers of Italian ice.
Okay, thank you very much.